Welcome. So this is the first talk in the Psychosis in the City series at the Green Clinic, or rather at the Foundation for Community Psychoanalysis, sort of paired with the Green Clinic speaker series. I'm really pleased today to introduce Kevin Duong. I think that many here may know him from his writing in Parapraxis magazine and from a really excellent appearance on the Ordinary Unhappiness podcast, which was sort of my introduction to his work. Kevin teaches modern intellectual history and political thought at the University of Virginia. He's the author of The Virtues of Violence, Democracy Against Disintegration in Modern France, as well as numerous articles on revolutionary theory and political culture in the 19th and 20th centuries. He's currently writing a book, Freud Against Empire, an experimental history, which maps how an international cohort of mid-century radicals, surrealist poets, painters, ethnographers, and psychiatrists and communists in France, Martinique, and Cuba, and the United States deployed psychoanalysis to undermine civilizational and global hierarchies. And this presentation reflects one piece of that project. So without further ado, Kevin Duong.
Thanks. I'm sorry for the hilarious TED Talk sitting situation, but we're navigating multiple devices, so I feel bear with me. This is part of a larger project I'll talk about throughout the talk, but I'll just go ahead and get into it, and I'm super happy to elaborate the larger book project in the conversation afterwards. So without further ado. In September 1918, Sigmund Freud was in Budapest, addressing the Fifth International Psychoanalytic Congress. The First World War was coming to an end. And so, in front of his audience, Freud made a prediction, a famous one. Up until that point, psychoanalysts had mostly treated wealthy patients. Therapy was expensive. But there was so much misery in the world, and it was wrong, Freud said, that ordinary people were excluded from psychoanalysis. And so he made a prediction, which is really a prescription, which many of you here will know, since we are, in fact, at a foundation that has also partly inspired this injunction from Freud. Quote, "It is possible to foresee that at some time or other the conscience of society will awaken and remind it that the poor man should have just as much right to assistance for his mind as he now has to the life-saving help offered by surgery, and that the neuroses threaten public health no less than tuberculosis. When this happens, institutions or outpatient clinics will be started, to which analytically trained physicians will be appointed. Such treatments will be free." Freud thought the future of psychoanalysis came with a mission: psychoanalysis for everybody, clinics and free analysis for everyone, psychotherapy for the people. That was what Freud called it at the end of his speech. My talk today is going to be about one mental health care clinic that tried to make good on Freud's promise of a psychotherapy for the people. Some of you most likely know about it, given that it is here in New York City, Harlem's Lafargue Clinic, which operated out of the basement of St. Philip's Episcopal Church on 134th Street and 133rd Street between 1946 and 1958. The head of St. Philip's Episcopal, Reverend Bishop, offered the basement space to the clinic for free. And the clinicians, in turn, offered psychoanalytic psychiatry for free. And by that I mean that they held onto a psychoanalytic theory of the subject, although many of their psychotherapeutic techniques we would more associate now with psychiatry. Treatment was free, or nearly so. Technically, each visit cost a quarter, which in today's valuation is about $3. But if for someone that quarter was too much, then the fee would be waived. And about a third of the visitors at Lafargue over the years paid nothing. The clinic did this for 12 years, every Tuesday and Thursday, normally between 6 and 8, although in practice it went way past 8, as we're going to talk about. The clinic staff were explicitly inspired by Freud's call for psychotherapy and the people. In this case, of course, the people in question were Harlem's residents, mostly but not exclusively African American, who either could not afford psychoanalysis, or even if they could afford to get treatment, would suffer from discrimination in New York's mental health care institutions. Free therapy was happening at Lafargue in a way that I don't think is actually very different from the Green Clinic, which many of us know about here in Fort Greene. But something else, I think, was actually happening at this clinic too, beyond implementing free therapy. What was happening, I think, was also a major attempt to adapt psychoanalytic psychiatry to a situation of internal colonialism. That's going to be my guiding claim today. We know from the humongous amount written on this in the past half decade that the idea of internal colonialism was everywhere at the mid-century. In particular, it's used by left-wing Black intellectuals to analogize the situation of African Americans here to the colonial condition of Asian and African peoples abroad. The idea being that if you're under French or British rule or living in Harlem, there's an analogy to be established there about your living conditions. So rather than seeing these as two separate phenomenon, people who talk about internal colonialism were trying to see Harlem and Saigon as basically two instances of the same global process. Lafargue's clinicians also thought of Harlem as an internal colony. Internal, of course, to the United States, but also internal in the sense that it's inside of our heads. They were concerned with the way that internal colonialism has a second meaning, the way that colonial conditions can sink their claws into our psyches, and the way this colonialism gets into our heads. In Harlem, Lafargue's clinicians were trying to make psychoanalysis work under these conditions. And it was precisely by trying to make psychoanalysis work in an internal colony that I actually think the Lafargue Clinic might have helped bring psychoanalysis closest to some of its earlier utopian ideals. It's not actually very easy, I think, to capture the revolutionary ambitions of the clinic in either theory or therapy. Because to see the clinic's ambitions, we have to foreground at least two things right away. First, I think we have to situate the story of the Lafargue Clinic in an international context and not an American one or even an African American one. And this international dimension is actually pretty obvious if you look at the clinic's ensemble cast. So on the left here, many of you may recognize him. This is Frederick Wortham. He's the founder and the director of the clinic. Born in Bavaria, Wortham studied Marx and Fabian socialism in his 20s before studying medicine and then being advised first by Freud and then Freud's colleague Ernest Jones while he was in Germany and in England. They basically sent him long reading lists, which, as you might expect, had like 100 books, and Wortham was like, okay, I guess I'll start. And the lists are pretty funny. It's like everyone from Genet to everything Freud ever wrote. That's how it went. Wortham emigrated to the United States in 1922. First, for those of you who studied the history of psychiatry, first he actually ends up at Hopkins, where he studies under Adolf Meyer. And in Germany, he's in the clinic of Emil Kraepelin. So he has a very distinguished psychiatric background. On the right here is Hilda Moss, Lafargue's chief physician. Born in Berlin to a very wealthy family. Her father was an advertising mogul. But later she leaves her family behind, at least politically. She studies Marx and Freud very closely. She eventually has affinities with Trotskyism, and she emigrates to the United States. She works as a child psychiatrist and is kind of as a child pediatrician at Queens General. There's also this guy here, Ernst Jolovich, who's probably the most orthodox psychoanalyst of the crew. Jolovich, German Jew, trained psychoanalyst, flees persecution first to France, where he delivers anti-fascist propaganda for the French radio between 1936 and 1939. He's then briefly detained in a concentration camp, after which he flees, and this I think is actually important for us to think about. He flees on the same escape route in 1941 that took the French surrealists to Martinique and to New York. For those of you who watched the Netflix series Transatlantic, it's kind of awful, but if you watch the series, you actually know about this transatlantic route. The surrealist and Jolovich are all actually on the same route. They're connected that way. In fact, here is just an excerpt. You can see here the list that Varian Fry, he's the director of the Emergency Rescue Committee. This is from the list that Varian Fry puts together of endangered European intellectuals who need to be rescued from Nazi persecution. And who is number 621? It is Ernst Jolovich, which is how we know, this is a very exciting moment in the archives, by the way, that a confirmation that Jolovich is in fact on the same escape route as all the other Parisian surrealists. Jolovich goes into exile, joins the Lafargue Clinic in March 1947. There are a bunch of others we could talk about. One of my personal favorites, Bronislawa Landry, born in Warsaw, trained as a psychoanalyst in Krakow, a Polish anti-fascist activist, arrested by the Gestapo, escapes, flees to New York, joins the Lafargue Clinic. I don't have any pictures of her, but I do have pictures of this guy, Andre Tweed, who you can see here. He's a doctor from California, and when he hears about the Lafargue Clinic through the newspapers, drops everything and moves to New York City to help out. Tweed was among the very first Black men in the United States to attain a full-time position as a psychiatrist in New York City. According to reports at the time, New York City only has 2 Black full-time psychiatrists, and Tweed is one of them, of course based at Lafargue. And there's a reason I'm displaying the clinic's ensemble cast right off the bat. Because they remind us, or they at least remind me, I think of something really important, which is that psychoanalytic radicalism was a global phenomenon. Psychoanalysis was a global phenomenon, of course, in a familiar sense. Analysts open clinics everywhere around the world. There are psychoanalytic associations everywhere in the world, Buenos Aires, Mumbai, Moscow. But psychoanalytic radicalism was a global phenomenon in another sense, which is that readers of Freud also were thinking about the globe, its organization, its hierarchies. They were thinking about empire and colonialism, some to defend it, but just as many, I think, actually to challenge it. So this talk comes from a larger book that I've been working on, which tells the story of a strange group of people who are almost friends, almost psychoanalysts, who read Freud very closely. These are surrealist artists in Paris and Cuba, like André Breton and Wilfredo Lam. Poets in the Caribbean, like Emma and Suzanne Césaire, who we associate with the Negritude movement. Poets, anthropologists like Michel Leris and Claude Lévi-Strauss, who is the father of structuralism, of which we then get post-structuralism, and then everyone spent a generation killing structuralism off, which is then killing off Lévi-Strauss. Lévi-Strauss was on the same boat, actually, from Marseille to Martinique and New York as the Surrealists and Yolovich. This is how they all begin moving in the same circles. And this is why actually, and I won't talk about this today, but I'm happy to talk in the Q&A, Lévi-Strauss says that structuralism was actually born out of his encounter with the Surrealists in New York City as they were going to flea markets together while in exile. Personally, I've always thought that the heart of psychoanalysis was something like this. Psychoanalysis inventories the price we've all paid for becoming adults. The process of becoming an adult, an individual, a reasonable creature, is so painful and requires so many acts of psychic amputation that we never actually really fully heal from that process. We never quite heal from the self-mutilation required to hammer away or to whittle down the infinite range of our infantile desires to become modern, bourgeois, mature adults. Adulthood is forced conscription, and we never stop picking at the scabs left behind by that process. And the unconscious feels a little bit like phantom limbs, which produce an itch, and it never stops because the process of becoming mature never stops. This, for me at least, was what psychoanalysis was when I first encountered it as a student. But for the millions of people who lived under colonial rule in the 20th century, it was obvious, I think, that psychoanalysis was something else too. Not just a way to measure the price we've all paid for becoming adults, but also a way of measuring the price of assimilation, of becoming subjects of the empire. What happens to your internal world when you're conscripted into empire? What happens to your psyche when you live under segregation? Or when in a single generation you're forced from your land in order to sell your labor for a wage on the market? What happens to us when our extended family structures are forcibly converted into nuclear bourgeois families? These were the questions, I think, that mattered to colonial subjects around the world. And these happen to also be the questions that miraculously psychoanalysis seemed capable of answering, at least in the mid-century. What would happen if we took these non-analysts asking these questions about empire to actually be the history of psychoanalysis? Not as it was, but maybe a history of what it should have been. What if we gathered their experiments together and their chance encounters with each other and said, that is what psychoanalysis is really about, a public language connecting everyday people because it lets them ask if conscription into the status quo was worth it, or whether civilization and empire were worth it. If we do that, I think we would see something remarkable. That as politically committed therapists fled Nazism and escaped to the four corners of the world, they also brought with them a radical philosophy that merged with radical politics almost naturally all around the various empires that were starting to wobble. This happened in the Caribbean, it happened in North Africa, and it happened in Harlem too. These revolutionary hopes are why the Lafargue Clinic took its name from Paul Lafargue. Paul Lafargue, mixed-race Cuban-born physician, political theorist, a man who participated in the 1871 Paris Commune, also better known as Marx's son-in-law. Lafargue's face was printed on the clinic's brochures, its door sign, its Christmas cards. The clinic staff knew Lafargue's political theory very well. They kept actually endless encyclopedia and dictionary entries describing his thoughts. So you find like 30 different biographies of Paul Lafargue in the clinic's archives. They knew why they picked him as their emblem. I think his biography probably embodied for them their hope of what psychoanalysis could someday be. But besides the clinic's internationalist staff, the other thing we need to pay attention to is the nitty-gritty therapeutic work, how they tried to cure people of mental illness. And that's what I'm going to try to focus on for the rest of the talk, because I think focusing on how the clinicians actually tried to approach curing is the best way to see how they tried to adapt psychoanalysis for conditions of internal colonialism. We can start with the clinic space, since that's where a visitor seeking a cure would have started. Obviously, it's very different from the space upstairs, as well as most people's private practices. A lot of us are probably familiar with the Freudian couch. Freud, the analyst, sits behind the couch. If you're lucky, he puts his finger on your forehead in an early failed attempt to be a good hypnotist. He's terrible at this. It never works. This is much to his annoyance. The analysand, or the patient, faces away. They free associate, and the physical setup is meant to choreograph an experience of dreaming. And so by not seeing the analyst's face, this is supposed to create what we often call a neutral transference. This will not be new to many of you all. Transference, psychoanalysis is all-important concept, in my view. Transference is when we transfer to an analyst unconscious thoughts that were once attached to someone or something else. So you can think about the well-known tendency in a clinical situation for a patient to start behaving with the therapist as if their therapist was their deadbeat dad. Transference explains our tendency to repeat in our adult relations emotional patterns from the past. We're usually not aware that we're doing this, that we're repeating, like a broken record. And Freud never actually thought that this repetition was necessarily a problem. It's not always a pathology. Actually, transference, this tendency for us to repeat our past social bonds, is one of the reasons why psychoanalytic curing is possible. It's precisely because we reproduce with the therapist what was once repressed that unconscious material can be resurfaced and made available for analysis and working through. Freud thought the couch was crucial to this. The patient didn't need to see the analyst's face so that the analyst could become a blank screen, an empty vessel on which we can foist a transference onto them. But if you contrast the Freudian couch with how the Lafargue Clinic was set up, you can already get a clue, I think, to the clinic's radicalism. So as you can see, it's a church basement. The staff put up these screens to create booths. At any given time, there were about 8 to 12 booths that were set up. This is where the analyst and the social workers would meet patients. There's no couch. There is, however, a desk. I'm pretty sure it's this one that's slightly out of focus. It's the desk that Ralph Ellison actually donated to the clinic as its first desk. Because from the beginning, Ellison and Richard Wright and other left-wing black intellectuals in Harlem threw their support behind the clinic. They were the ones who helped Wortham and Moss set it up from the beginning by donating things like furniture. And from the beginning, Richard Wright described the clinic as, quote, the extension of the very concept of psychiatry to a new realm, and, quote, the turning of Freud upside down. This central space here that you see with all the folding chairs, it is a waiting room. This is where patients would mingle with each other as they waited their turn. But after clinic hours, they would turn this space into a classroom. In the classroom, everyone, and I actually do mean everyone, secretaries, psychoanalysts, social workers, clerical workers, patients as well, would gather to discuss difficult cases and to give presentations. There's a reason, I think, why Amsterdam News, which is the city's major black-run newspaper at the time, called the clinic, quote, one of the most democratic places on earth, and this is not an overstatement. That's a very unusual thing for the Amsterdamans to say about the basement clinic, one of the most democratic places on earth. There wasn't space in this cramped basement for one-on-one therapy. I hope that's obvious. By necessity, treatment had to happen in a group setting. But instead of just complaining that they didn't have the space to do what they wanted, Lafargue's clinicians had to make do. And they made do with this cramped space by incorporating into their cure work the group dynamics that inevitably arose from the cramped space. Patients met other patients, of course they met other patients. They couldn't not meet each other in this space. And sometimes they'd give each other support or advice. And the clinic encouraged this. They actually considered this a form of patient-to-patient therapy. Here's how Hilda Moss described the clinic's group therapy in a research memo from 1947. Psychotherapy begins even before the patient sees the doctor. The organization of the clinic, the training and attitude of every member of the staff enhances or hinders the success of whatever method of psychotherapy the psychiatrist may choose to employ. It is very important to accept this as a part of psychotherapy. It cannot be classified simply as reassurance. It must be designated as therapy through a group. I want to emphasize this idea of group therapy. Some of us, many of us, are probably familiar with group therapy. It's pretty common today. You can see it with Alcoholics Anonymous. You can see it at a slightly more elevated level with the Anna Freud Center in London. I think there's a group therapy room upstairs. Group therapy was less common in 1947. And at Lafargue, group therapy was a way of making do with the fact that they just didn't have enough space for traditional psychoanalysis. The interesting thing, though, is by making do, the Lafargue clinicians actually did learn something new and something unexpected. They discovered that sometimes group therapy actually is better than one-on-one analysis. It's not just a compromised form of therapy. Sometimes it is better. They learned to see and to appreciate that every person in a clinic has a therapeutic role. Every person counts. Every person has something to offer or something to bring to a clinical encounter. Psychoanalysis belongs to everyone, but it might also depend on everyone too. Wortham liked to quote sometimes we'd say this quote, other patients could dispel misconceptions better than a psychiatrist alone could have done. And this is why he encouraged patients to actually talk to each other. And according to the clinic's minutes, training seminars at Lafargue were not just for the certified psychoanalysts. They did include the clerical staff, including the women who took the quarters and put them into the mason jar. Everyone got training in psychotherapy because everyone, by virtue of stepping into the clinic, became a psychotherapist in their own way. But even more amazing, I think, patients at Lafargue sometimes seem to have transference, not just with other doctors and patients, but the furniture as well. So according to one of the psychiatrists, quote, they have a pride about the place. They get a kick out of each new piece of furniture as if it belonged to them. A journalist visiting the clinic noticed the same thing. Patients take a proprietary interest in the premises. The acquisition of a new table or lamp is always cause for excited comment and congratulation. This is a hugely expansive idea of group therapy, I think. It's not one-on-one analysis that Freud developed. It's not even today's support groups. Group therapy as involving the total clinical environment, including its built environment. You can have transference with an analyst. You can have transference with Ralph Ellison's desk. The point is that they're all here to make room for your speech or to solicit your language. And it's not just that group therapy is different because it's bigger too. Like Fanon, Lafargue's clinicians were emphatic about what we now call to be the sociogenic origins of mental illness. Sociogenic analysis means tracing the etiology of mental illness to social conditions and not only lesions or repressed fantasies or daddy issues. And you can actually see how this works very practically in the patient charts. So this is an example of the type of patient chart they used. As you can see here on the left are the patient symptoms chronologically organized, ulcer symptoms, fatigue, phobias, kind of a classic roster of diagnostic labels. And on the right, you have social and biographical developments. When a patient loses a job, when war breaks out, that kind of thing. And it was a very simple device, they thought, which were supposed to bring together into unified perspective both psychic and social determinants of a patient's life history. They called these charts a way of spotting important socio-medical concatenations. And I can talk about in the Q&A too, but a lot of the case files from the clinic actually have to do with people who were just recently fired or lost their jobs. And this was like a really crucial part of their diagnostic critique of actually getting employment history and the industry in which they were employed. In emphasizing sociogenic mental illness, the clinic was a reflection of its historical moment. This is a moment when everyone is trying to unite Freud and Marx. Can you unite Freud and Marx? This, it turns out, was an enormously important question to theorists during the Cold War. And that included the theorists at the clinic too. One of them had been studying Marxism almost as long as he'd studying medicine. But during and after the years at the Lafargue Clinic, we know from his research notes that he was also reading people like Lukács, Fanon, Hannah Arendt, and the African socialist theorists like Sékou Touré and Kwame Nkrumah. And in fact, Richard Wright's daughter, Julia Hervé, was sending copies of Nkrumah's books from Accra, Ghana to the clinic. So we have, for example, in the clinic's archives, Nkrumah's Neocolonialism, the last stage of imperialism, and this was sent by Julia Hervé to Wortham for the clinic's holding. References to people like Nkrumah do start popping up in Wortham's research notes beginning in the 1960s. The Lafargue Clinic tried to use Freud and Marx to explain the materialist dimensions of psychopathology. In other words, to adapt psychoanalysis for Harlem. And unsurprisingly, it led them into open warfare with mainstream American psychiatry. I can outline a bunch of ways in which they do this, but for now, let me just highlight two of the ways in which they waged war against mainstream psychiatry, at least in New York City. The first is that they completely refused what we now call ethnopsychiatry. So many psychiatrists at the time, people like this is Columbia University's Abram Gardner, like a massive figure in mid-20th century social science. People like Gardner would invoke what they called the racial character of the Negro to say that the psyches of oppressed peoples were unique because of generations of slavery and oppression. It was as if human minds obeyed Lamarckian evolutionary laws. So in the same way that Lamarckian scientists thought that if you chopped off the tail of a mouse 20 times, you'd suddenly have mice born without tails. It was as if generation after generation, if you kept wounding minds, you would produce a thing called like a wounded mind. This was supposed to be a way of acknowledging difference, and it produced the field that came to be called ethnopsychiatry. Lafargue's staff despised ethnopsychiatry. So take, for example, Charles Collins. I don't have the picture of him, but this is one of his publications. One of Lafargue's best researchers, and along with Andre Tweed, was one of the few black men trained in psychotherapy in the city. And from his position at Lafargue, he attacked the endless studies coming out about a special, distinct thing called the black psyche. He considered Abram Gardner at Columbia in particular, quote, a cruel and monumental fraud. All this talk about the black psyche or the white psyche was basically just progressive race science. There's no such thing as a racialized psyche. There are just psyches that are wounded in virtue of being in an internal colony of the United States. And the rejection of ethnopsychiatry was not just theoretical. It actually did affect their therapeutic work. So for example, the clinic's staff refused to pair people up based on superficial ideas about who was alike. They refused to organize therapy according to demographic categories because our ideas about what it even means for people to be alike is precisely what should get exploded by Freud's writings on the unconscious. We can never predict, according to racial categories stipulated in advance, what kinds of bonds people are going to form. We can never know in advance when two individuals are alike or not. And that's why a Dominican boy waiting in the clinic has just as good of a chance of forming a transference with a Polish woman waiting on a pew as with a doctor in a white coat or even with Ellison's desk. Anyone can, in theory, form a link with anyone else. To refuse ethnopsychiatry, they thought, was a way of trying to embrace the fullness of our connected possibilities, which are implied by the existence of an unconscious. Thinking Freud and Marx together, though, had another very controversial implication. This is probably the most controversial. They were convinced, based on their therapeutic work, that Freud was wrong, that humans do not have an instinct for aggression. Freud famously suggested, as many of us know, in the 1920 Beyond the Pleasure Principle, that aggression, Freud thought, was a human instinct, that humans have a natural propensity towards violence. In the middle of the 20th century, this idea that humanity has a natural propensity for violence actually got weaponized by many Cold War liberals. They adopted these anthropological assumptions because it actually satisfied their anti-communism. If humans have a natural propensity for violence, then the large-scale cooperation and harmony and solidarity promised by communism was a pipe dream. The Soviet Union, Maoist China, later experience of African socialism in Tanzania and Ghana, these are all premised, Cold War liberals thought, on an anthropological impossibility. So again, in dozens of research papers, Wortham, Collins, Yolovich, and especially Moss went to war against this claim. Aggression was not an instinct. It was only a free-floating potential. And sometimes, yes, aggression can be channeled into violence, but sometimes aggression can be channeled into other things too, like work. And Freud himself had actually suggested this possibility in Civilization and Its Discontents. So in a letter exactly on this topic, Wortham wrote, "Unfortunately, my copy of Freud's Civilization and Its Discontents has vanished. This happens, as many of us know. But I believe the statement about work is in that tone. Or in substance, the statement is to the effect that work is one of the best forms of sublimation, and it's too bad that man does not try it oftener." Humans have the potential for violence, but that is not the same thing as saying they have an instinct for violence. That potential can be channeled in all sorts of ways, like work. And that was actually why the clinic made employment assistance as part of therapy. They helped patients get jobs because they assumed that people who can have a little bit of self-management in their day-to-day life can also tolerate their neuroses much better. They helped patients apply for disability benefits, and they would often show up to court to testify before judges that in fact their patients could successfully hold down jobs. It is not an exaggeration, I think, to say that Moss and Wortham believed that the critique of violence was central to their anti-fascism. So Moss argued time and again in her papers, quote, "An instinctual account of aggression implies that violent behavior is healthy and should be accepted, and that attempts to prevent and ultimately abolish it are doomed to failure. But this is wrong," she thought. Quote, "Human beings have a capacity for violence, but this is something different than an instinct for aggression. To accept that aggression is an instinct," she thought, "is to lend psychiatric support for fascism. To accept that aggression is an instinct is to write off socialist futures as impossible." And for his part, Wortham never got over the fact that German psychiatrists lent their scientific credibility to Nazi extermination as violence. And when you read their letters, you actually do get the sense that they are obsessed with almost redeeming psychiatry from its role during the World War. I think from this perspective, you can begin to see how the Lafargue Clinic's therapeutic work dovetailed with its theoretical work. Making therapy accessible to all, helping residents find work as part of that therapy, showing up to court on their behalf, making sure that they could prove that they were not innately violent, even if they were neurotic, even if they were psychotic. This is actually a way of demonstrating that violence is not inevitable. They were trying to prove clinically that other arrangements of society are possible. They were trying to tell people that we should be allowed to want something more than liberalism, a society where it assumes that everyone is in a war all against all. Thanks to some of this research, the Lafargue Clinic was famous in its own time. For example, the US Supreme Court actually cited the Lafargue Clinic on racial alienation in Brown v. Board of Education for school desegregation. Thurgood Marshall, who argued the case, later wrote this letter to Frederick Wortham. Quote, I hope that you and the members of your clinic will have satisfaction in knowing that your great efforts contributed significantly to the end result. You may recall also that the Chancellor, this is the Chancellor of Delaware, specifically referred to as one of America's foremost psychiatrists. Besides this, you and your clinic's work were mentioned in our briefs on several occasions. The Lafargue Clinic got featured in magazines, TV documentaries, newspapers outside of the United States, the New Republic, Life magazine, Ebony. All of these journalistic portraitures were very appreciative. They're very nice. But I think they uniformly mischaracterized the clinic's work. These magazines never really understood the clinic's intervention in psychoanalysis, and they never spotlighted the clinic's insane rejection, passionate rejection of Cold War liberalism. Instead, they portrayed the clinic as a charity, as a humanitarian experiment in inclusive mental health care. And I think we can actually see the clinic being misrepresented literally. So consider documentary photography, that quintessential mid-century medium, the glossy photo essay. Think of photo essays by Gordon Parks in Life magazine. Documentary photography in America, unlike some of its surrealist analogs in France, lean into a positivist visual language. So they are typically about facts, not symbols. They pair photographs with statistics, not surrealist experimental poetry. As a visual genre, the mid-century glossy photo essay has its roots in a New Deal agency, the Farm Security Administration. Historians of photography will know this. One of the FSA's missions, the Farm Security Administration's mission, was to document rural struggles in America. This is basically how a whole generation of documentary photographers made their careers, including people like Gordon Parks. And to that end, so the FSA hires a bunch of young freelance photographers to do their work, who are now studied in art history as some of the canonical figures of the history of photography. One of those photographers was this guy, Richard Saunders. Born in Bermuda, Saunders was already a full-time documentary photographer when he took the photos that you've been seeing of the Lafargue Clinic. He took them for Richard Wright. The photos were designed and arranged into, what else? A glossy photo essay, as you can see on your right. If you look at the original photographic contact sheets, you can actually see what I think is the positivist visual language of documentary photography in mid-century America. So for example, if you look at these photographs, the number of photographs on all the contact sheets in general, the sheer number of them that focus on doctor-patient relationships massively outstrips the number of photographs taken of either patient-to-patient relationships or patients in a wider clinical context. Saunders is trying to capture the clinic's work, and I think he does it beautifully, but I think the point of view is actually totally wrong. Almost all of the photos are tightly framed. And by being tightly framed, they actually cut out all of the wider therapeutic relations that the patients form with each other and with the space itself. Saunders' photographs, in other words, I think are photographs of multiracial medical expertise. They're not photographs of revolutionary psychiatry. The Lafargue Clinic, and I want to be emphatic about this, was not an anti-authoritarian experiment. Like psychoanalysis in general, the clinic believed that authority had a therapeutic role. It served as an enabling constraint. When a psychoanalyst puts you on a couch and constrains you to talk, and to talk endlessly, to sit down, to look ahead, and to talk and to not stop talking, they're wielding their authority to constrain you, but by constraining you, enabling you to do something that you would never be able to do in everyday life, which is just to talk endlessly. The Lafargue Clinic was all about enabling constraints, and it believed therapeutic authority was crucial to that. But that did not mean, and they're clear about this, that therapeutic authority had to be monopolized by any one group, like psychoanalysts. Anyone at Lafargue could authorize or be authorized in turn. Anyone could bring out someone else's speech or speak up in turn. The clinic's space, the manner of its therapeutic practice, was all about multiplying authority, not abolishing it. It was actually about producing authority in abundance, producing so many transferential bonds that anyone of any race or sex could occasion free association by anyone else. But Saunders' photographs, I think, block from you this multiplication, this abundance of authority, because it's so focused on capturing medical expertise. The same blinders are in the photographs of this person, Lisa Larson. Like Saunders, she's a documentary photographer. She also eventually works for Life magazine. If you look at her work, it's like photographs of like the Princess of Monaco. You know, it's like really like elite photography. The photographs of the Lafargue Clinic, a few of the ones that you've also already seen in this talk, were actually hers. And like Saunders, Larson also is obsessed with staging medical expertise. So the photographs that you've been seeing, I now want to do big reveal, should not be seen as actually documentary. They were staged by these photographers in order to capture what they thought the clinic was supposed to be. These photographs are, in my view, evidence that the clinic's political ambitions were actually widely misunderstood, even in their own time, even when they were praised. These photographs purport to be documentary, but what they've actually been documenting is not what the clinic was, but what the wider public wanted it to be. In other words, inclusive, multiracial medical care. And I don't think this misrepresentation was an accident. The clinic's history coincides exactly with the Second American Red Scare, with McCarthyism, with the trials of the House Un-American Activities Committee. McCarthyist repression actually did affect the Lafargue clinicians deeply. So, for example, Wortham testified on behalf of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, and because, so these are for those of you who don't remember, these are the folks who were accused of spying for the Soviet Union and were executed. Wortham testified on their behalf and got major blowback for that. He got wrecked by politicians for his defense of them, and he was so worried about anti-communist repression that he actually used pseudonyms in his research notes. So, for example, Lenin, Luxemburg, and Marx. When you examine Wortham's research notes, you never actually see Lenin's name, which you see is Zurich, bed. You never see Rosa Luxemburg's name, it's just Rosa or an R. And this is the craziest one. You rarely see Marx's name. Instead, you see Karl spelled with a C. I'm not entirely sure who that was supposed to deceive, but like Karl says that the history of all this is history of class struggle. So take that for what you will. But my point is, even, and this is cool for a psychoanalyst, even in his own quote-unquote private research notes, he's hiding himself. That is how deep McCarthyism is actually penetrating into this archive. Anti-communist paranoia meant, I think, that the Lafargue Clinic was sometimes deliberately evasive about what they were doing. They downplayed their connections to international Marxism and anti-colonialism because those identifications would have been risky. Another piece of evidence on this score. I've lost count of how many newspaper articles about the Lafargue Clinic I've read from this period. Every single newspaper article at this time tells you that the clinic is named after Paul Lafargue, that Lafargue is a Cuban-born mixed-race physician. Not a single one tells you that Paul Lafargue was Marxist son-in-law. Not a single one. The connection to third world Marxism is deliberately downplayed or erased. I think the reason magazines never really understood the clinic, despite commissioning so many glossy photo essays, is because the clinic never bothered to correct the record. The misrepresentations probably suited them in a climate of repression. This was another way, I think, in which the clinic just had to make do, in the same way that it had to make do with limited cramped space, by turning to group play therapy. The Lafargue Clinic was not a beautiful experiment insulated from the contradictions of its own historical moment. They could do what they did because they had to make do with what they had, which wasn't much. And in any case, I do not think we should romanticize the Lafargue Clinic. There were real contradictions in what they tried to do, and we should be honest about those contradictions. So for example, take the emphasis on sociogenic mental illness. If you combine Marx and Freud, like Lafargue's clinicians tried to do, you'd have to conclude that people are mentally ill because society is ill. That poverty, underemployment, ferocious discrimination, racial contempt, homelessness, crowded tenement housing. All of these features would make anyone go mad. And if you take this route, then the obvious response is that therapy must not only treat the mind, but it must also treat society. There's actually a danger here. If you think society is sick, and you think that society sinks its claws into the psyche, it's only a step, and a very small step, to say that you have to regulate public culture to protect psyches. Think of the children, think of those kinds of moral panics. And indeed, Wortham and Moss are actually most famous, not among intellectual historians, but among comic book fans, because they led the crusades against comic books in the 50s. Wortham's seduction of innocent was actually the subject of congressional testimony about the effects of comic books on children. They were convinced violence in comic books made kids violent. Superman and Wonder Woman make us violent. This, in my view, is totally absurd. We can argue about that. I think this flattens the complex relationship between culture and the psyche into a flat-footed panic about negative social influences, as if the psyche and culture don't have a much more complicated mediated relationship. But this was and still is, I think, the danger with an emphasis on sociogenic mental illness. It can make us vulnerable to moral panics. I don't think these contradictions are the result of bad thinking. They reflect the real circumstances in which the clinic had to do its work. Acknowledging these problems, I don't think, should be an excuse to dismiss the clinic's work, but should remind us, I think, that no liberation politics, however ambitious, can just wish away the undesirable conditions that make people want liberation in the first place. Making do in politics is a way of doing something new with what you have, but making do isn't magic. Making do doesn't cancel out the initial conditions, even when it makes something new. And even the most successful revolutions in history never really transcend the conditions that give birth to them, because I think revolutions, just like psyches, are haunted by an unconscious too. Let me conclude by returning to what I actually just said. If you buy the thesis that mental illness can have sociogenic origins, then I think the obvious conclusion is that the real cure for mental illness is social revolution. The reason people in Harlem suffer from anxiety, neuroses, and psychosis is because of the actual material conditions of Harlem. Only social revolution can change those conditions. And this was, in fact, the exact conclusion the Lafargue clinicians reached. Social revolution is the only real mental cure. The problem is that no one can actually design therapy around something like that. So here's Moss. We cannot wait for social and economic circumstances to change before we have to treat our patients. Because if you wait for the social revolution to treat your patients are going to be dead. Wortham, quote, they, traditional psychoanalysts, would have her lying on a couch, telling her life history, while they tried to discover why she had not had enough love from her father, but hell with that. Her problem is one of living now, and she didn't come for anything else. There are limits, I think, to what therapy can do. Therapy is not politics. Its processes may condition it, its success may depend on it, but therapy is not politics, and I don't think we should ever conflate the two. The Lafargue Clinic knew that social revolution was the real cure, and that they would have to fail their own standard for curing. Everyone at Lafargue was consistent and honest on this point. They would have to fall short of their own theoretical conclusions about what it would take to treat their patients. So instead of social revolution, the best they could do was here's how they describe it, something much less. Quote, what the Negro needs and what psychiatry must help him find is the will to survive in a hostile world. This phrase, the will to survive, is repeated a few times in the clinic's archive. It's a phrase I'm going to conclude with. I think helping someone find a will to survive can look like a bad substitute for real curing, which takes years. It's obviously a lot humbler definition of a cure. It's about helping someone live with their brokenness without forfeiting their will to survive. And I have to admit that at first I found this definition of cure a little bit disappointing. For one, there is a resemblance here to neoliberal grit culture, just endure, go through it, work for 20 hours a day. There's also a sense in which maybe you're partly helping people, but only partly at best. And I want to be crystal clear that I do not think there's prefigurative potential here. And what I mean by that is, again, the Lafargue Clinic did not think of itself as a laboratory for the future. It did not think, we can argue about this given where we are, they did not think things at the Lafargue Clinic were scalable. The staff were completely clear that they did not think they could remove the roots of mental illness because the roots were in colonial capitalism itself. And worst of all, the only reason the clinic could work was everyone had full-time jobs elsewhere. It's actually, the way that I sometimes think about it is it's a parasitic institution. Like, it works because everyone actually has private practices or full-time jobs at the local hospitals. Like, the clinic is not actually doing it for free. It's siphoning resources from every other aspect of everyone else's lives. And the clinic was absolutely clear. People kept visiting the clinic asking, how can we replicate this? And they were like, do not replicate us. We do not want a world in which everyone is doing free labor all the time. That's not a model for mental health care. So they kept telling people who could visit from all over the country how to mimic this. They're like, this is not, like, what we're doing here is important, but its importance does not lie in scalability. They were just trying to meet people where they were and to do the best they could to adapt Freud to a context where nobody had any money and any time for psychoanalysis. Although the more years I've spent working on this clinic, the more I have come to begrudgingly concede that maybe a will to survive isn't actually such a small thing. And to show you why, I'm going to end with one of the clinic's cases. I'm going to call this final patient, Patient M. Patient M was a sex offender. He was being treated at Lafargue throughout 1955. But in February 1956, he wrote to the clinic to excuse himself for, quote, not keeping his appointment because he was in jail again. Patient M had apparently committed another sexual assault. Of what kind, I can't tell from the existing records. And here is the letter that Patient M wrote to the clinic after he was arrested. Please do not give up hope. This does not mean that I have failed. It's just a long setback. There are not enough Lafargue clinics. I believe that I was about to approach the cure stage had I not come to this. I'll return there again someday, so don't destroy my records, please, and don't close the clinic. We're not all hopeless cases. There are those who appreciate the sacrifice of your time, especially when there are other things all of you could do so much more recreational. Society is not a bad place to live in when you meet people like you. If I hadn't been what I am, I wouldn't have met you, though I wish I hadn't been as I am. I'll keep in mind that I have some place to come and somebody to come to. And as you might guess, it's actually impossible because the clinic closed a few months after this. So the reality is that there was no universe in which Patient M could have come back. And the records of Patient M, as far as I can tell, are destroyed. How do you repair something like this? Where's the cure? Clearly, Patient M didn't get the cure he wanted or needed, and someone paid the price. Isn't this a clear case of failed treatment, a failed cure? I'm not so sure anymore. What I've come to respect about M, despite his violence, is that he hasn't given up on getting better. You might even say that the clinic helped him find a will to survive. I'm reminded of a psychoanalytic commonplace that my teachers told me about the compulsion to repeat. We have a compulsion to repeat, they told me, because implicit in the repetition is the hope that someday we can repeat differently. That's the unconscious basis for compulsive repetition. Maybe this time, of all times, things will go differently. There's no fixing what M did, and I don't think that's the job of psychoanalysis. All analysis can do is to protect the will to survive in spite of the brokenness. It's not much, but it's not nothing either. And actually, I now think that instilling a will to survive is something very hard to do. It's not the cure we want, but it is probably the cure we need, because the fact is that it's the picture of the cure that the Lafargue Clinic had to make do with in circumstances they did not choose. And unfortunately, those circumstances are now more than ever our circumstances. Thanks. questions?
Okay, all right. Wow, so thank you so much. This is amazing. In starting off, sort of, what I'd like to talk about, I think I have to do this sort of awkward thing of introducing myself, but also introducing the foundation and this series a little bit. So my name is Chris Landry. I'm a psychiatrist. I'm a first-year psychoanalytic candidate at Columbia, and I'm a grantee of the Foundation for Community Psychoanalysis. My day job, however, is actually being the associate medical director of a therapeutic community for people with serious mental illness called Fountain House. And although it is not psychoanalytic, it is not sort of communist or socialist, it is looking to create a context in which people relate with one another, with the space that they're in, with sometimes the furniture or the plants or the art, but certainly one another and the staff there, and through the new kinds of relationships that develop in this community to have transformative experiences and live for the better. This series is one that kind of grew out of the Green Clinic's ongoing speaker series, but I wanted to focus on what I called psychosis in the city. This talk is obviously much more about the city than psychosis, but in the sense of serious psychic disturbance and perhaps the loss of reality that occurs in neurosis, psychosis, and everyday life. And holding it here is really rooted in the commitment to community psychoanalysis. In the opening conference for this foundation that happened in September, there were really kind of two strains that emerged in what community psychoanalysis could be. One of which was making psychoanalytic treatment available to the masses, let's say. And the other was to work and think psychoanalytically in other kinds of community settings to do the sort of community work, community mental health work, or something that perhaps isn't even officially mental health work in a psychoanalytically informed way. The project of the Lafargue Clinic is interesting because it really sort of splits the difference between those two. And so I think could be a really generative thing for us to think with, despite its limitations and shortcomings. And so, there are so many things that I could ask you about right now, but I think a lot of people in our audience are themselves clinicians or doing some kind of work related to psychoanalysis and or community mental health. And so I want to think about a few things that are closely related to that. The first and maybe kind of most jarring and at least for me really exciting is what they did with transference. And I almost find myself wanting to strip the Lafargue Clinic for parts and think about how can I do work that's informed by this better. But I'd like to ask you, and this may be an impossible question, but what, as best you can tell, what does the working with this transference, right? Not just the elicitation of transferences to a desk or a receptionist or another patient, but how do you then work with that?
Yeah, it's a great question, and as you might guess, it does depend on the patient and the context.
Absolutely.
So there may be one thing I'll immediately, the one thing that jumps to mind with the kind of transference all over the place model, which people will be familiar with from institutional psychotherapy too, is in this particular case, it actually, the way that I sometimes think about it is that it delivers a measure of clinical authority actually to social workers and secretaries. So you wouldn't, I'm not sure I can give you a description of how they work with it psychoanalytically, except for the fact that it's precisely because transference goes everywhere in these spaces, that when you read the case files, they're very actually clear that for many of their patients, the social worker actually has to be the primary analyst, so to speak, if that's actually how the transference neurosis took shape and which later must be dissolved, then it sucks to be them, but the social worker then must take on that role.
Right. This in an era when only MDs were permitted
Yeah,
to train as analysts.
Right, and they're actually very reflective on the fact that they lament how people will know this is the question of lay analysis. They take pride in the fact that at one point psychoanalysts were very proud of the fact that you could become a psychoanalyst without having an MD degree and being a physician, partly because this brought many women into the profession, and partly because it empowered people with that professional backgrounds to become analysts, and so they resent the hyper-medicalization of therapy in the United States. So that's part of it. It's like there's a big part of the clinic story that's actually about, and this reflects their historical moment, of empowering social workers as having a very crucial role within the way the clinics are organized, and not just medical professionals and analysts. As for how it actually worked in practice, though, it's kind of all over the place. If you were to judge by a lot of the case files, it works great. I sometimes read the case files with a little bit of a skeptical eye, because the most comprehensive ones come from, frankly, the orthodox analysts. And the case files that are written by some of the either the clinicians in training or even just the secretarial staff, it's like, Bob came in. Bob had a great time. I'm like, I don't, like, as a non-practicing therapist, I can't do much with that. So that's a hard question to answer. But in principle, I would say that the idea, maybe not clinically, but logistically, actually has to do with just the way that they conceived of the division of labor inside of the clinic. The relative role of secretaries and social workers and patients themselves in the organization and state that they work. And this is related to, it's only kind of related to why they often had patients lead their own case study sessions in seminars.
I mean, one definitely can read those kind of spare case files skeptically. On the other hand, I bet that there could be a lot that develops in milieus which certain writers don't know how to articulate in speech or in writing, but which happens nonetheless.
So actually, therapeutically, there is an interesting set of subcases that speaks to this, which is that many of the clinic's patients are children. I think, if I'm remembering right, maybe about a third of them, or maybe even close to half of them are children. Many of them have speech impediments. There's an obvious problem with the talking cure when the patient that you have who's been subject to the talking cure has a speech impediment. And so actually one of the things that they do with play therapy, the pictures that you saw of them playing with blocks and playing with each other, was actually both to provoke a transference neurosis with other kids, actually precisely because the assumption was that play was a non-verbal way of activating someone's capacity to begin symbolizing when verbal forms of civilization are foreclosed because they have a speech impediment. And so the transferential overflow, the transferential abundance in that sense, did have a therapeutic role of getting people to speak non-verbally mostly through play for children, so that you have something to work with as you're trying to work through these patients. And based on the limited case studies that I have in the records, some of these kids totally flourished under this model of good play therapy, the ones with serious speech impediments.
I can't help but think of institutional psychotherapy.
It's your job too.
Which of course is my personal obsession, and something that's been very professionally useful, but was the Marxist psychoanalytic kind of model system of treatment that arose in France during and after the Second World War, really initially based in psychiatric hospitals and asylums, but there, for other reasons, because people were sort of profoundly psychotic rather than children with speech impediments, might not have been speaking or spoke in ways that others couldn't understand. And there they implemented a program of what they called ergotherapy or therapeutic work. But that included everything from, like laundry and cooking to clinic administration to making art. And Francois Tosquet, is the psychiatrist who sort of founded this school, had a famous line that I don't think I'm going to reproduce exactly, but that we think not with our head but with our feet, that you have to be going somewhere, and it seems that would be the kind of adult translation of play.
Yeah, No, there are moments in which I wish this clinic were closer to the history of institutional psychotherapy because the resonances are so real. Like I wish they had this like insane vision of like the entire asylum itself is what needs reforming, and that you'd have transference with the walls, you can do the newsletters, you can do all these forms of amazing play. But they do, actually, I do have a couple pictures of them that I'll show. They do art forms of art therapy, so see, these are some of the drawings from the kids. And this is actually, this one in particular, not these two, is from a kid with a speech impediment. Yeah, exactly. So it's not as ambitious as institutional psychotherapy, but the parallels are totally there. And it's not treating the problem of psychosis, but it's similar, which they constantly talk about as if the kids can't speak, you have to find other ways of creating links between them and the social, if language isn't going to be it. And it's spaghetti against the wall. Do anything you possibly can to form whatever links you can. Transference the wazoo out to the clinic, because once you have one link built, there's an opportunity to build on that and to build on that and to create a whole chain of links to reintroduce them back into the symbolic universe. And if it can't be done through words, then like fine, it'll have to be done through Play-Doh blocks or through drawings. So the resonances I think are totally spot on.
Yeah, and sort of to that point, you had talked about the way that kind of anyone in the community of the clinic could engage in the therapeutic act of constraining or being constrained that allows for some new mode of relating to emerge. Do you get a sense, and again, I'm probably going to be asking you questions that can't be answered, but like how, or did the clinic regulate these ways that people would engage with one another? I guess I think most especially about contexts in which someone might have been doing something with or to someone that was harmful or undesired, or when there was disagreement about what to do.
Yeah, so there are, the picture that I give here obviously doesn't differentiate between the forms of mental illness that they're treating. So a lot of what I was talking about, and a majority of their patients are patients who are diagnosed with what they called at the time concentrated anxiety. And those of you who know the history of pharmaceuticals, these are the kinds of patients who will eventually be treated with like sedatives like chlorpromazine and stuff like that. So for those patients, you can kind of do this kind of therapy. They had totally severe cases in which either a traditional form of psychoanalysis, 101, would be prescribed because this is actually what's best for this patient. And if the person was particularly violent or dangerous, they would have to refer them to another hospital. So basically, I mean, like a lot of clinics, they would only take the patients they thought they could have some traction.
I mean, that's the problem in literally every therapeutic space that's ever existed.
They're not exempt from it. That said, the rules were, honestly, the rules might have been less strict for the kids and more strict for the adults. If I'm thinking of the cases that are coming to my mind. It's a lame answer to say it's on a case-by-case basis. But with children, they seemed pretty confident that even children who supposedly had behavioral problems or issues with violence, that still the best way to treat them was actually basically unregulated play therapy. In fact, and this gets dicey, but I think sometimes the play therapy would be monitored by Aaron Stilovich, and sometimes the point would actually be that no one would be there. You'd have to trust that the other kids would have to do the work for them. There's a very famous case as in like I'm obsessed with of a boy who teachers sent him there because he had behavioral problems, but he also, they assumed, had a learning disability, and they speculate that it's dyslexia. And this boy joins group play therapy for several weeks, has a total blast, is not monitored, and then these teachers realize he suddenly started reading. And then they asked the clinic, how did you teach the kid to read? And they're like, we didn't. That's the whole point. We did group play therapy for the kid to, first of all, get out of it, like their like obsessive, neurotic, anxious states, and then lo and behold, their own capacities activate. We did not teach this patient to read, but we created conditions for the child to learn to read. You, teachers, assumed that must have been dyslexia rather than a psychic block, basically. And that was the case in which there was no a weekly oversight that was actually unmonitored play therapy. Anyways, so that's like the craziest case, and then there are cases in which like the doctor's just standing there prescribing pills. You know, so it's like the whole gamut.
I mean, it reminds me, there's a psychoanalyst named Jonathan Lear who extends Winnicott's conception of the good enough mother into a good enough world.
Yeah.
And it makes me think that perhaps the clinic created like at least one room in which there was a good enough world.
Yeah, he was actually my psychoanalysis professor a long time ago, and he would sometimes talk about like the virtues of the good enough, in that similar way. That and you know he's obviously a practicing clinician, so he thinks about this too. You're not aiming for perfect. You're aiming to get them going, is the way that he sometimes talked about it. Getting going is about the best that you might be able to do, but it's more than nothing. I'm a little torn actually which direction to go. But can we talk about the sociogenesis of neurosis? We can.
There are a number of different ways that this has been articulated, and it might be helpful actually to just sort of situate this in intellectual history. Because you articulate some dissatisfactions with how the Lafargue Clinic approached it. But do you think that that's sort of the end of the story on sociogenesis, or are there other ways? Are there rescues or critiques that we can make?
I totally buy their model of sociogenesis, and I do think it's very similar to Fanon. And their argument isn't that every mental illness is sociogenic. That would be kind of bananas, actually. But that any mental illness could, at least you couldn't theoretically rule out that it might have a sociogenic origin. Like there are many cases in which they basically conclude this seems to be an organic problem, so we have to kind of treat it as an organic illness. So it's you know, they're not the kinds of theorists who think that if you have a social revolution, the mental illness disappears. What worries me about them isn't the emphasis on materialist dimensions of human life producing pathology. It's that sometimes the way that they talk about it, and I think this is an actual real danger you can see today, and if you're not really scrupulous about how you trace the actual mechanics by which social conditions produce mental illness, you can back yourself into the trap which they fell into, which said therefore we need good holding environments for people. And I didn't talk about it in this talk, but they, as you might expect, wrote a lot about families. They, on one hand, are really, really actually ahead of the time for endorsing transitioning for what people at the time would have been intersex or transsexual. So in fact, Ernst Jolovich himself is on record in several newspapers arguing with other psychologists saying that patients should be allowed to transition, and that because people's psyches do not always match their bodies. So they're incredibly far in advance in this. And at the same time, they're like, but we should also make sure that this process happens in like a good environment, basically, i.e. like they often imply good families, because the sociogenic model posits that you need basically a good environment in order to weather these difficult moments, and that pushes them into this position of talking about like good families. And the language of good families keeps cropping up in these unexpected ways where, okay, so we know that there are sociogenic reasons why the children in Harlem are having like mass anxiety and behavioral problems. Yes, sometimes they do talk about like the importance of stable home lives and domestic lives. That both make sense, and they fall into a language of like conservative home fixing upping. And that again, it's like, it's a way, it's not, I don't object to their sociogenesis. I am acutely aware of their case, the ways in which you can back yourself into this corner where then suddenly we're always, which happens to them, that they fall into the comic book scare. They fall into these scares about broken families. And they both can offer a social explanation of those families, but it doesn't change the fact that they still view good families as reparative. And that's, I don't know what to do with that anxiety. I don't think it's a dead end, but it is, I get worried unless you have a really precise model for how something like poverty can produce concentrated anxiety, then you can like do what Hilda Moss did and wear them, which is you go to DC and you have these like huge blown up panels of like comic book pages from Superman, which are actually weirdly violent, by the way, because they're all in the archives. I was like, oh, I didn't know those scenes were in Superman. And then they're like basically pointing them as like, like this is like what's seeping into our children's minds, and this is why they're so violent. And it's like, that's not a great way to like talk about this, but also like you kind of shot yourself in the foot there because you couldn't figure out the mediation between society and the psyche, and in your most hyperbolic moments, you allowed Superman to become a culprit, or something like that. And anyways, people argue about whether video games make boys violent. I don't have too much skin in the game, but I am intrinsically suspicious of those kinds of debates.
I do wonder if that position, say the comic book scare, is a kind of compromise formation. Like when you think that social revolution is the therapeutic act, and you renounce it because it can't be accomplished through your therapeutic method.
Yeah.
Like, is this the sort of political change that was realizable? And then there's a sort of, you know, mournful acceptance of a substitute.
I wish it were.
Yeah.
I hope that's the case. I hope that's what happened.
Yeah.
And this isn't incompatible with what you just said, is that it's a compromise formation, but you do read their letters, and they are so juiced to give these talks in upstate New York at like PTA meetings. So like, is it a compromise formation? Probably, but like, can you also like hypercathect a compromise formation? Of course. And right, they totally do. I mean, it's like, and then the letters from the PTA moms are like, oh my God, your talk was amazing. You know, it's like, and so you like, so like, it might be a compromise formation, but this is, I mean, it's, and it was, like, I don't think it is wrong to actually say that without Wortham and Moss, the comic book regulation system set up in the late 60s would have happened. Like, it was their congressional testimony that helped push it forward. Anyways, you're probably right. I hope you're right. But then, like, you read these letters, like, well, they're really enjoying this compromise formation.
Yeah, I may be too willing to like try and find some kind of rescue here.
I'll, if I can say something to that. It took me a long time to both love this clinic and try to not make it fulfill all my wishes, which I think is like super important with working with this history, because I want to be able to assimilate a history that lets us see them for what they are, to get out of the Cold War mist that hides a lot of them, but that also means like not turning them to my own avatars of, like, I wish they were like Jean Oury or Toscaya's, but the fact is that they're in the US, and it's just a totally different, you cannot pull off cool.
The horizons of what's possible.
Yeah, totally. And I actually get antsy about us wishing that away. Like they couldn't do what they did in the same, they couldn't do what Fanon and Jean Oury and Toscayas could do. They just couldn't. And I think pretending like they could would be dishonoring them. I don't know. The work that they did.
There is a sense, though, that working in kind of the context of broke psychoanalysis, right, the title of the parapraxis version of this, that I wonder if it made some things possible that wouldn't be, right? You described the kinds of renunciations involved in achieving mature bourgeois subjecthood, and one of the strictures is a desire for privacy. I know that you gave a very similar talk at the Cornell Psychiatry Department's DeWitt Institute just about a week ago, and there, I didn't get to hear the whole thing.
But they came for blood.
But then,
Oh my God.
So this sort of like older establishment, MD psychoanalysts, many of whom I have great respect for, but I do think there are limitations, right? It sort of built into that perspective. I believe one of them asked you, right, like, you can't have privacy in the space of this basement. Doesn't that fundamentally constrain what can be spoken in the space, right? That privacy is the necessary precondition of this work. And to that, I have to say, like, BS, right? But that if you tried to do this in, a Madison Avenue office suite, yeah, absolutely, right? You couldn't. Right. But when this is the thing that you have, and the other option is nothing, and you know that the people there care and that they're doing what's possible with nothing, then I suspect new forms of subjectivity emerge.
I mean, I totally buy that, and you could easily flip it. It's like, I sometimes want to disagree with these analysts. Like, have you never failed an analysis before? Like, what is going? Like, you have these like fancy private offices with like soundproof doors and beautiful muslin curtains, and like, I don't see yet evidence that your success rate is dramatically higher than Lafargue. Like, you might have succeeded with patients differently, with different kinds of patients, but like, you know, it's the assumption like. Of course, privacy would maybe allow certain things to be spoken. It can also be a form of blockage in the same way that being in a hallway with other random people that you don't know can be liberating in ways that being alone might not be. I mean, like, I don't think taking a theoretical position there in advance helps. But the attack came from, well, isn't privacy going to stop their ability to speak? And also the fact that this is in a church, isn't that a problem? And I was like, I suppose for some, but not for others. Like, this is like, and you're exactly right. It's like, if the point is to form links where they weren't before, to solicit speech and to symbolize in ways that couldn't be symbolized before, I'm not entirely sure why a one-size-fits-all model would be so dogmatically adhered to when no one can actually replicate that model in mass anyway. I mean, but I admit that I was actually shocked by the resistance.
Here, Fanon seems like a very useful corrective, not to Lafargue actually, but to these questions.
Yeah.
In as much as, right, when he tried to implement what he had learned from institutional psychotherapy in France, from Tosquelles, who he did basically his psychiatric internship with, in Algeria, he found that it didn't work. And it worked with the European patients, but not with the Algerian patients. And so what he had to do was actually go out into the community, essentially start doing ethnography, and figure out why these techniques that were so engaging to European patients fell so flat with patients with another background. And he was working under people who were very much under the sway of ethnopsychiatry, and who could have seen that failure as proof of the sort of, you know, racially inferior Arab. But he articulated a notion that each person has to be addressed in a mode, right? Each person has already been formed by the entirety of their experience, their culture, their language, the people that they've known, their religion or lack thereof, and have to be addressed in a way that is intelligible to that kind of subjecthood, and not that translations aren't possible, but that there has to be a place of address for the subject that you're working on.
I mean, it's actually the example that you just made me think of are the kids with speech impediments, which is that I have no idea what privacy is supposed to do for them versus play therapy, like that's just not a form of therapy that at all speaks to their conditions or what would make them speak up or not speak up. No, I mean it's the and the example that you're thinking of when Fanon discovers that the Muslim wards do not like love these like drama play games that they had set up for the European patients.
Or the parties for no particular occasion.
I mean, like, I don't know, that still confuses me. It's like, why would we want parties for no occasion? But no, but it's the that you build the links to the form, the worldliness that people have acquired throughout their whole life, and you start with that, and you find the points of connection there. The idea that privacy would always be an enabling constraint is baffling to me for that reason.
So before opening up to questions from everyone, I want to kind of think a little bit about the ultimate inadequacy of this project. The question of scalability is one way of looking at it. The having to operate as sort of parasitic on jobs that pay, parasitic, though not in a hostile way, on the church, but on sort of the time and effort of all involved. For those of us who are tempted to make this the avatar of everything that we want, or who are making institutional psychotherapy, or whatever other kind of bold effort that either failed or existed in another, in like a very different political economy, how to start thinking, not an answer, but like how to start thinking about a way forward.
Yeah, I mean, so maybe one thing that I'll say is I might have been too hard on the scalability question, because obviously there are many ways of funding these kinds of institutions besides just making everyone work second jobs. Although anyone who's also been a union organizer knows how much it sucks to have a union as your workplace for when you're not an officially paid organizer, and that's labor that makes you want to kill yourself. So I'm going to borrow a phrase from a colleague of mine who likes to talk about clinics as way stations for freedom. Like these are transitional spaces. We're not imagining a world populated with Lafargue clinics, but you might need 1,000 Lafargue clinics to get to a place where you can try to think about something else. And so the way that she often, and she's in particular actually talking about the meaning of Lida for a phenomenon as a way station, as a kind of halfway point. I do not think that anyone would want a world of parasitic institutions that make people perform extraordinary, heroic acts of charity with their time. But you might need some people to do it, to create enough sites for a different way of organizing mental health care to be brought to fruition. I don't have a much better answer than that. It would be great if we had 1,000 Lafargue clinics, but we would never want a system that depended on them. And I think that's how the clinicians often thought of their work too. Mm-hmm. Like they were very clear even from the beginning, they didn't think of the Lafargue clinic, there's a reason it's in a basement too. They didn't look for funding to build a fancy building, they didn't look for funding to like have...
Didn't they look for funding and then systematically failed to get
So in the last 2 years of their existence, they applied for funding to a new law that New York State had passed that was supposed to channel state funding to mental health care clinics. They were denied because they could not produce a budget, which they had to politely explain, well, we don't have a budget because we have no money, which is why we're asking you for money, and it's like weird to have to be able to produce a budget to get money. We don't have any. But it was political actually, because the state tended to give money to adjacent clinics like the Northside Center actually in Harlem. And my assumption, and I'm pretty sure it's an assumption, I'm pretty sure I'm right about this, is that the clinic was denied not actually because they couldn't produce a budget, but because of the politics of their clinicians. But they didn't want that money so they could like build a fancy building. They were like, it would help us like buy, I don't know, notepads and like maybe like repaint the booths a bit. You know, it wasn't.
So that they weren't even trying to pay some of their staff.
No, in fact, that was never part of the question. Like they just, that's why it's like they really, I think, from the beginning assumed that what they were doing was both indispensable and also totally transient. Not totally transient in this like flip way, but like it was a way station. You have to do this in order to get somewhere else, but what we're doing here is not the model of the future, though you probably can't get to the future unless you try something like this for a while. No, so they didn't apply for money to pay the staff. It was to cover kind of like basic maintenance costs.
Well, thanks, Kevin.
Sure.
I'd like to open up the floor to questions.
Yeah. Okay. Hi, my name is Lisa. What I know, I'm the only Black person here. Very exciting. So I don't know if this is a question or a statement, but a child's right exam. Although I appreciate the focus on sociogenic causes, I believe biogenic causes rooted in nutritional needs is important, right? Like vitamin D, all those other things. In addition to that, like psychogenic curiosity, I feel like is important. And the word that came to mind for me was wetico, which is what like indigenous people call like the sort of spiritual parasitic sort of thing that's in our society. And I was that kid talking with AI, like how does that pertain to white supremacy? You know, so I almost feel like sociogenic, psychogenic, and biogenic sort of a holistic approach, because I think these things are interactive.
Yeah.
And as much as I would appreciate for a social revolution to occur, I'm absolutely confident that we will still be dealing with this sort of parasitic nature of our society. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I mean, diagnostic. This is kind of what I was referring to. That they don't assume that every mental illness has a sociogenic. Like they're very clear that like many of their clients have biogenic origins of their mental illness, which is why they'll either refer them to another clinic or to get them prescription medication. The sociogenesis there might even be described, it's like an invitation for them to begin systematizing it's a term that's no longer in vogue, but they're kind of people who imagine society as a totality. So like you cannot explain mental illness by like taking one particular slice of society. You need to be able to see it as an integrated whole. The language of integrated whole makes a lot of people in that generation feel a little bit anxious, actually, because it has kind of resonances with a vision of a totalitarian society or a mass society, or like a society is like a giant subordinate blob, basically. So I think they would, in response to your comment, be like, setting aside that they call it like a sociogenic emphasis or something like that, what they're actually after is we cannot accept that it's repressed fantasies that are actually causing our patient's illness, but that it is society understood as an integrated whole that is making our patients ill, which is why then they say you would need to change all of society in order to actually cure patients, and we can't do that. So it's, one way of then perhaps responding to your remark is like they know they're going to fail. Almost like the premise of their clinic is that they're. For me.
Yeah. What you think?
Oh. Wow. I've never asked that. God, that's a great question. It's a tough one for me. I think I kind of agree with them in the sense that we should have a social revolution and there's going to be mass mental illness after it. And that's not the measure of success. I think but now I'm kind of spitballing, so I may walk this back. Is that the social revolution is not going to get rid of mental illness, but there's a lot of mental illness that is unnecessary. You'll never get neuroses, but you might be able to get rid of unnecessary neuroses, or at least fewer neuroses that are produced by the overall structure of society, and that would be
or perhaps an opportunity to live better with or in spite of them.
I get slammed for this, but I think there's virtue in getting by, and I don't think that is another way of putting it. Like I don't know. For me, people getting by and there being less neuroses, even though we accept that we're never going to get rid of it, that for me would count as a form of success. But
thank you for a fantastic talk. I wonder, I was really interested in your account of the intellectual history behind the clinic, which turns out to be far more complex than I had realized. I wonder if you could explain what you think Richard Wright, who said that we need to turn Freud upside down, what he meant by that exactly.
Yeah. Well, one answer is that some of you may notice this is an allusion to Marx saying that he's turning Hegel on his head. So there's an allusion there of like, well, and I think Wright is wrong in this, but he reads Freud as really overemphasizing psychogenic illness. And so turning Freud on his head would mean noticing the materialist dimensions of psychopathology. But there's also the sense in which it's a bit of a play here in which they also mean the clinic's in the basement. Like it's part of Wright's interest in like look at the places in which therapeutic work is happening that you don't really see. It's the church basement, it's not the Bright Clinic, it's the hallways and the streets that are dimly lit, not necessarily the hospital wards. So there's kind of both meanings there of we're flipping Freud on his head the same way that Marx flipped Hegel on his head, and like look down under. This is obviously like a very big theme of Ellison too. Look into basements. So there's a bit of play on words there as well. Yeah.
It sounds like you're saying something like, we're talking about how a social revolution would maybe cause more mental illness, and a lot of this psychoanalysis is happening in basements and in underground spaces. So do you have any ideas or thoughts about, instead of neurosis, this unconscious psychosis that is the fabric of
Yeah, so actually in the essay that Richard writes on the clinic, he calls it psychosis. He thinks that what's happening in Harlem streets is a form of break with reality.
Well, in all of culture.
So they're, what they don't do is make that kind of argument, because they actually have, and I admit I share this, they're not particularly sympathetic to the arguments that say that because we live in a mad society, only mad are actually sane, because they actually think that kind of is a bit glib towards the way that people really suffer. So they're pretty allergic to turning mad people into our heroes. And that's part of why they shy away from this vision that, like, if all of society is mad, then the mad are the only truly sane. Because they find this to, whether it's true or not.
But it seems to be the vessel for all our social ills. Like, don't you think that if there was a communist revolution, we would ban Bibles the same way that he was talking about banning comic books? Like, there's going to be a moral reaction to the things that are taboo or transgressive, no matter what side you're on. Like,
So they wouldn't think that, and this actually has some interesting connections to the fact that that Stalin actually hated Freud and preferred Pavlov. So actually both Lenin and Trotsky were into psychodynamic theories of the mind, and one of the major reforms that Stalin implements under the new economic policy period is actually to replace psychodynamic models of the mind with Pavlovian reflexology, because Pavlovian
but it
reflexology.
wasn't reflexology in the US and SAR. It was actually really holistic. It was not the idea that the dog would just salivate because
Sure.
of the bell. It was like all the cues from the environment
Yeah.
that had happened to the animal before that.
Right, I guess I would associate that stage with, and this is, I mean, to your point about the comic books, that does lend itself to a much more censorious public approach to public culture. I guess I just have a hard time seeing the clinicians thinking that way, because they view, so much of their lives are as anti-Stalinist Marxists, and they're anti.
That's why I didn't work.
I'm not sure I would put it on them that way. Yeah.
First, I just want to thank you for this really wonderful talk. Eye-opening history, really wonderful to learn. I guess I'm curious because, so you framed the Lafargue Clinic as a radical place for, you know, how we see psychoanalysis, how psychoanalysis is practiced. But also in the media, you said it was misconstrued as like a charity, a form of work that wasn't really radical, just, you know, white people. I know there's like maybe one like black psychoanalyst technique in the clinic, like mostly white people giving like black people free psychoanalysis. And then I was really struck by the conclusion of the Lafargue Clinic, or the ideal of like the cure to mental illness is social revolution. I guess the one contradiction that I see is that the Lafargue Clinic itself could be seen as a form of control and complacency, in that like this is like we're giving psychoanalysis because there's no other way to go forward. So I'm curious what the founders actually did and how they were adjacent to the civil rights movement at the time and what they were doing to push social revolution actually.
Yeah, so it depends on the clinician, as you might expect. I should actually add this note of correction, about half the staff is not white. Right, because the staff, in fact, so among the clinicians in white coats, they're more than 50% European, but if you actually take the staff of the clinic as a whole, it's a genuinely multiracial clinic, and the newspapers at the time both celebrated that, and that's kind of why they get this reputation as being like a kind of multiracial charity. So it depends on the clinician. Moss starts going, after the clinic closes, starts going back actually to Berlin, where she gets involved with radical student movements there. Tweed, so much as I can gather, goes back to California, becomes fabulously wealthy, and collects art, much of which is in the collections at Morehouse. Wortham gets involved with primarily giving presentations and talks about the connections between psychoanalysis, anti-colonialism, and social reform. So he's mostly like on the beginning of the 60s and 70s in the lecture circuit. This is, the big exception here is that for maybe 4 or 5 years total, they're extremely involved in consulting for the lawyers who are involved in NAACP legal legislation. This is actually controversial itself because then there ends up being a split between the NAACP and the Lafargue Clinic's clinicians, because the Lafargue Clinic, the NAACP basically prefers the psychotherapists at the Northside Center because they're a little bit more, this is their term, they're more LaGuardia liberals. So the Lafargue clinicians themselves serve as legal consultants until this fracturing between the NAACP and them kind of happens. That's actually the context of this big blow up that they later have, where they're invited by the NAACP to celebrate Brown v. Board of Education. The Lafargue clinicians refuse to go, partly because of the fraying relations between them and the NAACP. Otherwise, beyond that, on the basis of the records that I have, which are not much, as far as I can tell, we know that they followed the civil rights movement and SDS very closely, because they have hundreds of newspaper clippings of all of them on Gandhi, MLK, SDS, and they've like underlined every paragraph. The problem that as a historian you have is I have no idea what they think when they're underlining. In the same way that when we annotate books, like, can anyone actually, like, I have no idea, do you like that, do you not, do you disagree? They do the same with Fanon. They've like underlined a gazillion pages of Fanon, but I have no idea what that means. So that's why it's a little bit hard for me to tell politically, intellectually where they stand with what we now call the 60s, that are mostly happening in the 70s. Yeah, so kind of a sloppy answer, but it's hard for me to piece together that picture, honestly.
Kind of a pedestrian question, but like, what does the orientation material archives look like for this? How do they get oriented to the norms of the clinic? So it's always going to be like a little bit curious also about just like self-governance in the clinic and then making like decisions internally.
That's a great question. Most of my answers from the earlier years, because I don't have good records for how they ran the clinic in the later years, basically notepad and pencil, really messy, and people constantly writing notes to each other. Hey, did you forget to do that thing that we all agreed needed to be, like the picture that you get is of a self-organizing clinic that is possibly could use with more centralization, even though they're like very anxious about that. So that's the picture you get from the earlier years. It's everyone kind of knows their job. People who are onboarded are given pretty strict instructions about what they can and cannot do. So for example, they're explicitly told, do not bother trying to do full one-on-one psychoanalysis. That's not what we're even here for. We're here to do a very specific thing, and we need to try to do it well. And then you get a bunch of paperwork that's like, well, that person kept showing up late. So if they're all, anyways, it's messy. You get a picture of an attempt at self-governance and messy day-to-day, ad hoc, almost month-by-month operations.
Just sorry to double it, but the orientation for the patients in terms of just like the lack of the same thing as what you dealt with the Cornell psychiatrist, but like the lack of privacy. How did the patients get accustomed to that? What were the norms?
Oh yeah, I don't know if I have a good answer to that question. The children seem to think that they were basically in an after-school specials program, or at least that's what they assimilated to. So some of their descriptions talk about it like after-school playtime. I don't know about the adults. Some of the letters that are preserved are fawning, and you get the sense that it's like a really intense, somewhere between a psychotherapeutic and a pastoral relation. But I wouldn't want to generalize on the basis of the case files that I have. Like you get the sense that that's because they're helping with employment assistance, they're showing up to court. You get a sense that they see the clinicians as not just clinicians. And Moss, in several of her research memos, defends this violently. Says neutrality is bogus. They're actually very clear that they think analytic neutrality is not going to work for them. And so it lends this pastoral dimension to their relationships. But I only have about 70 case files. and they served over 1,000 patients. So I would be hesitant to generalize more than that. Sure.
Do any of these people who came together at the Lafargue preserve any kind of the institutional memory of the 3 clinics set up in Europe at the end of the war?
Yes, so Moss and Wortham are explicitly avowing it. So they cite that tradition as a precedent for them. They're very aware of the ambulatorium and the Vienna ones. Most of the staff that come by the 50s are American trained social workers though. So they do not. They view the clinic as an interesting mixture between psychoanalysis, psychiatry, and social work. So they're more severed from that relationship. And then the third tradition, of course, is that none of the clinicians think this way, but their support from the church comes also out of an uplift tradition that is very prominent among Episcopalian churches in general. And so there's that kind of, that's not the European free clinic tradition. It's community uplift and care that they're drawing some of their support from. I would say by the end of it, one of the reasons the clinic closes is because they lose Jolovich, who he's like in his 80s by 56 and retires. He's probably their strongest link to the European psychoanalytic tradition, the most orthodox trained, by far the most accomplished of them as professional private practice psychoanalysts, and his departure kind of nudges them to closing the clinic when they're like, we've kind of we're tired, we can't keep doing this anymore, the church is under new leadership, they don't seem as enthusiastic, Jolovich is retiring, and so you do get a sense in which those that connection to an earlier history phrase as the years go by.
Yes.
I was wondering about, as a follow-up to the question about the lack of privacy, what other constraints or norms there's evidence of being broached? I was wondering about things like touch.
Yeah.
If there are any other aspects of interaction that, that there's record of that wouldn't be tolerable in
Yeah, well, it's a great question. I mean, I don't have any records of something like touch, although it seems statistically impossible in some ways for that to be the case. Probably the place in which you would see other norms being explicitly broken are probably household visits for children, which is more like, so that's, is it psychiatry or social work when it's a psychiatrist doing it? That's a little bit odd, although they're very happy to do it because they're in the neighborhood. It's a great question. I'm not sure if I go beyond that. The other shortage, though, the other way they make do with shortage is obviously the money situation. So, if you were, I suppose, lucky enough to not even have enough money to go home, they would use the money in the muffin jar to pay for your taxi cab home. So like the money's flowing in the reverse direction. Maybe the only other way that I can think of is they accept donations. They never get any major donation from the state. They get, as far as I can tell, like possibly thousands of donations the size of a quarter from people around the US. And so in that sense, it's like, there is a moment in which the clinic is like a celebrity superstar in the culture, and they're getting these like quarter donations from people in Kansas who are like, here's my quarter donation for your work and stuff like that. So it's not the kind of rule breaking they're talking about, but they do leverage the fact that they're an unusual institution in order to gain publicity. Yeah, it's a great question, though. Thanks.
I think we've got time for one more question.
I guess I just wanted to acknowledge like the first question. I think one of the things that's so compelling about the clinic is that it is serving like working class New Yorkers, and especially Black New Yorkers, which is really like the promise of, I think, what community psychoanalysis should be. And that's like one of the tensions in the room right now. That's like what something like this should also be meeting. So I just wanted to say that, and then I really appreciated your talk, and I was, it ends in such a devastating way. With that client getting out of jail to the clinic being closed. And I guess that this is me like filling the clinic as the avatar of everything I want it to be, but I guess I would like to think that the lack of privacy in the clinic could also be seen in a positive way as like a communalizing or communizing of the space and a transforming of people's subjectivities in the way that it had such positive effects for children, that would also be true for the adults in the clinic. And I would like to think that maybe that's the healing aspect that would stick with that person too, when they say like there needs to be far more Lafargue clinics in the world, that like that's actually something that person will carry inside them and maybe feel more apt to live in that way in other places in their life. So
I mean, yeah, thanks for saying that. I mean, when I first read that letter, that was obviously kind of a gut puncher. That was not the most pleasant thing in the world to read. And you know, so the reason I struggle with this is because and the reason I can sometimes sound like such a downer about a clinic that I otherwise so unconditionally admire, is because I'm put in this awkward position of they think they failed, and I'm in the position of wanting to say they succeeded, even though they think they failed on their own terms. And then you have to do the things like, am I making them fulfill my own wishes? Well, and how do I feel about making them fulfill my wishes when they are very honest about failing their own project? I absolutely think people were transformed by the experience, and that all of the clinicians go on to have long clinical careers, and it's impossible for them to not. And in fact, in the archives, you're right, actually, that there's a whole folder of letters of people who interned at the clinic and then right back to the clinic even and 15 years later, thanking Wortham and Moss for changing their life. So we know they had an impact that way. But the reason I struggle to call it a success or failure is precisely because I don't know yet how I feel about the fact that they don't talk about themselves that way. They don't talk about themselves as a successful romantic experiment, and they're warning people who are facing the clinic, don't do that, because that might be a trap too. Right, so anyways, I don't know what to do with the fact that I do think that they had an enormous impact on thousands of patients and hundreds of clinicians, and yet they refuse to call that success. And it feels weird to then say, well, you were wrong. Even though they might have been, you know, and we're entitled to say that after the fact, but that's why I struggle with it.
All right, that's all the time we've got. Thank you all for coming, and thanks, Lindsay.